Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Recompete pilot program phase one evaluation debrief. I appreciate everyone's participation here. My name is Scott Andes. I'm the program director for the Recompete program. Really, the goal today is to walk you through how EDA did the phase one evaluation, how we thought about the different evaluation criteria, and provide some best practices that we saw in the phase one, and then some common pitfalls as folks begin to think about potential ways of using their strategies for other competitions, or in the event we run the program in the future, next year and the years to come, how to improve upon your application in future years. So with that, and really the run of show is I'll walk through a presentation. I'll take 20 to 25 minutes. My colleagues, Asia and Rachel on the team, will be monitoring the chat. If you've got any questions, please do stick them in the chat. They'll both be responding in kind in the chat, as well as calling out questions. And then we'll have plenty of time after the presentation to walk through any questions, comments, or anything else folks may have throughout the process. So with that, let me share my screen and we will kick things off. All right, if Rachel or Asia or Pam could just let me know if you can see my screen, we will rock and roll.
It looks great. Thanks, Scott.
Great, excellent. All right, let's get started. So just wanted to first lay out as a reminder what the real point of this competition is. It's important because this was the lens through which we viewed all of the over 560 applications and really thought about and what success looked like. So as you all know, the Recompete pilot program is a $200 million program that is aimed exclusively to support highly distressed communities around the country. In this vein, as called out in our congressional statute, we target ways to improve employment for those in the prime age 25 to 54 range. But at the highest level, this is a place-based, community-based program with highly flexible dollars to support economic distressed areas, create economic transformation, progress, and opportunity. Throughout the following 20 or 30 minutes, I'll talk through how we use the evaluation criteria for phase one in the phase one NOFO to really make sure and pull in the strongest applications as we could into this process. As many of you know, it's also a two-phase competition similar to a number of EDAs, other large national programs, specifically the Build Back Better Regional Challenge and the Tech Ups program. And with that, I wanted to give a little groundwork here. So first of all, this was an incredibly competitive program. We received, as I just said, over 560 applications. It does represent the largest EDA program to date. Over $6 billion in requests for that $200 million that we are appropriated. So just an extraordinarily competitive process, and one that we have full intention and hope to replicate in the future. So we really do hope that this is a useful time for us to share some of the observations we made from some of those successful applications, and then hopefully try to illuminate some common pitfalls that we observed through this process. I'll also say some of these might look a little different than previous competitions, either at EDA or across the federal government. This is a new program. One thing, though, that we tried to do is very directly mirror how we evaluated these competitions to those 7 evaluation criteria in for the Recompete plans and for the strategy development grants, just to be as crystal clear and transparent as possible. So just a little bit of flavor on the application pool for folks. Of those 565 applications, they split between, as folks as may recall, you had two choices. You could apply for a Recompete plan approval, which was the gateway into phase two, those strategy development grants or planning grants that were at around $500,000 or both. So we received 225 Recompete plans, 340 planning grants. A small subset, about 15%, only applied for Recompete plans. About half applied for both, and then about another half, roughly 40%, applied for just strategy development grants. And in terms of organizations, one of the things that we're really proud of is we really have applicants that cross the spectrum of community implementation, from nonprofits to local governments to tribal communities and educational institutions. Not surprising, nonprofits and local governments did represent the majority of applicants in phase one, and I think that makes sense. A lot of those entities are really responsible for training, transportation, childcare, a number of the things that this program is largely created to support. But as the program team and the evaluators had no priors or biases on the type of organizations, as long as. So again, the goal of this program is really to review those 22 finalists and 23 strategy development grants and offer some thoughts as we proceed. So this map, for those of you who haven't seen it, this is the map of those finalists, the 22 finalists and 24 planning grant winners. So just to orient folks, if you see just a dark blue dot, those are one of the 22 finalists. If you see a blue dot with a yellow circle, that means they both won, were a finalist, and awarded a $500,000 roughly planning grant. And then the yellow dot were those planning grant winners that in this year's competition were not finalists. So as many of you could see, while we didn't cover the entire country, we covered a large span of some of the more distressed areas of the community country, from rural areas to urban and everything in between. We'll briefly talk just very quickly about that. Again, it's impossible to overstate how competitive the process was, with less than 10% of plans being approved. I will say also, despite the competitive nature of the program, the 22 finalists really did represent the spirit of this competition. They were all incredibly distressed communities, and we'll talk through not just their level of distress, but also how the evaluators thought about addressing that distress. But while our congressional statute had 2.5% and 5% as point above the median prime age employment gap, we had over three times that. So on average, the finalists were 10% below the national average for prime age employment gap, and median household income was 1/3 below the national average. So I think it is fair to say that the finalists of the program really do represent the spirit of this, and we'll talk through that a little bit more. Also, I'll say we worked really hard in the phase one evaluation to really think about making sure this portfolio represented distress across the country. So you'll see rural areas, tribal areas. You'll also see a number of large cities represented that have highly distressed pockets of poverty and everything in between. I wanted to lay out just a little bit to give people a sense for what the budgets looked like overall. So not surprising, about 1/3 of the finalists' budgets represented workforce training, and that really crossed the spectrum from stipends to apprenticeships. Roughly a quarter were for wraparound services, and here these are things like transportation, childcare, but also things like addressing drug dependency, addressing recidivism rates of incarcerated individuals, lots of things. And I think really what you're seeing here is a suite of different ideas that applicants have brought in. There's not one type of policy that was successful. Really, applicants brought in a whole slew of successful interventions and programs that we hope to support. Along those lines, we saw a lot of activity around small business and entrepreneurship. And infrastructure also mattered a lot. So this program has an extraordinary amount of flexibility. So there was roughly 150 million of the 900 million of those finalists seeking infrastructure investments. And this is everything from building buildings to improving urban blight to residential well-being and everything in between. And then finally, a common theme in all of our large national programs. This team also ran the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, but also similarly for our Tech Hubs Challenge. Governance is a really critical factor. So we've seen a number of applicants bring governance ideas to the table, and we're happy to talk a little bit more about. For those strategy development grant winners, and again, remember those planning grants. So here, of the 24 winners, that represented less than 7%, making it one of the most competitive competitions that we've seen. And here we also saw a significant level of distress amongst those planning grant winners, as well as diversity of applications from tribal areas, representing labor, local governments, nonprofits, and everything in between. We certainly saw a wide range of geographies from large cities and mid-sized cities, post-industrial areas, rural and small towns, and a mix. So here, we did not have any strong prior on the type of region or community. We really did have sort of an all-comers approach, and that's exactly what you see in those that were successful. I will say one thing that we pulled from some of the data is that the strategy development grant winners, the service area, so that's the area they defined as the place that they wanted to impact. Remember, the geographic scope was a really important part of this competition, tended to be a little smaller than either sort of historically what we've seen at EDA or what some of the larger eligible areas would be, around 30,000 people. And I think this you'll hear as I walk through the evaluation criteria is a sort of a signal of something we were looking for. We wanted, while we had large geographic areas that were rural and small geographic areas that were urban and everything in between, we did want to make sure that whatever the service area was identified, we thought that grants between $20 and $50 million could really impact those. So it was rare for areas with, 250,000 people or otherwise to be successful, just simply because we wanted, it just turned out that many of the compelling proposals had a concrete set of areas that could be impacted with grants of this size. Sorry, I have something in my throat, so I keep drinking water. All right, so next what I wanted to turn to, which I imagine is of most interest to folks on the call, is walking through the evaluation criteria and strengths and weaknesses that we saw. Again, in this competition, we tried to be super purposeful with those phase one evaluation criteria. We wanted to sort of not hide the ball at all. What we were really looking for, we wanted to bake it into those 7 criteria for the Recompete plans and 4 criteria for the strategy development grants. And so now what we'll do is we'll walk through how applicants responded, both things that we perceived as strengths and things that hopefully can be lessons learned, and then also equally constructive feedback on things we thought were weaknesses. So as a reminder, I keep saying 7. There were 6 evaluation criteria. We'll walk through each one of these. The first 3 were 15 points. The remaining 3 were 9 points. And for each of these, we'll talk very briefly about the goal of that evaluation criteria and how we looked at it, and then again, those strengths and weaknesses. And then we'll do the same thing for the 4 strategy development structures. So to begin with, the first criteria, one of the three worth 15 points, was understanding regional conditions and needs. And what was really, really important here and why we thought this was critical is we wanted to make sure that applicants and successful applicants really did provide crystal clear and signaled a deep understanding of what was going on in the community versus potentially just giving a list of ideas that they might want to pursue, but really how tethered were their ideas and how tethered were the investment prospectus to regional needs and community conditions. So first, in terms of strengths, so from the successful applicants, we saw clear evidence of needs with a historical context. And here that looks a lot of different ways for a lot of different applicants, but sort of oftentimes applicants would give us a little flavor on why they believe these conditions were the case. But more importantly than just the historical context, they gave an indication of why those needs could be addressed. So it's one thing to identify some areas, but there were times where we were left after reading the 8 pages saying, well, what can be done about this, right? So the goal here is not simply to identify distress. The goal is to identify distress that can be supported through large-scale investments between the $20 and $50 million. And so that was really critical. I'll say one piece of feedback that I observed was oftentimes applicants would spend the lion's share of the 8 pages simply talking about distress levels versus getting to either really crystal clear the why, and then more importantly, what they think they can do about it. So you'd read almost 3 pages of like statistics and other things on regional distress, which is helpful to add a flavor, but really we wanted to know that clear sort of analytic argument why that was the case and what you could do about it. That was really critical. I'll say there was a clear alignment between the chosen service area and the region and those needs. So it wasn't just that there were people out of work or there were businesses that had left, but there was a sense for this is the service area, this is the area we picked and why we picked it, and the needs that we have identified in this application are applicable and specific for those areas, so that we were left confident that the applicant really did understand and make purposeful decisions at every step of the process. Again, kind of a big picture theme of this, we don't have any priors or biases on virtually anything in terms of how people made choices. We wanted to hear a clear articulation of your argument for why you made those choices, and successful applicants did that very well. Outside of just some of the high-level statistics and really specifics. I'll also say that successful applicants did a good job really zeroing in on specific populations and targeted groups, like who were the folks that were meant to be benefited and why. Some common pitfalls. First, there was oftentimes very little sort of data or analysis beyond just very high level things on wages, income, the prime age employment gap. What we wanted in terms of the analysis and on economic distress is like give us some sense and economic justification for your concerns versus just the very highest level data points. The generalized descriptions of regional conditions and needs often lack the clarity on the why. Again, the goal of this was what's going on, why is it happening, what's your theory of the case. Oftentimes we really just got a list of data and not an argument, and we really were seeking that argument. And then finally, I'll say the thing that often tripped up a number of applicants is we saw this as a very particular program that was meant to address prime age employment and wages specifically. And so we wanted you to tie it, well, there's lots of really important challenges out there, from climate change to economic justice and other things. We wanted to make sure that you are articulating needs specifically towards driving employment, driving jobs and wages. And oftentimes applicants went a little far afield in that domain. So if that first evaluation criteria was around needs and the argument for that, the second one was around what are you going to do about it? And here in some of the more high quality, successful applications, we saw a true link between the proposed strategies and the underlying regional conditions and local assets. So they all tied it together in a very crystal clear way. One of the pieces of advice I gave the merit reviewers is to say, once you've read the application, take a step back and ask yourself, in less than a minute, could you describe the theory of the case? Like, what is the specific elevator pitch that is happening in this application? What are they trying to accomplish and why are they doing it? And successful applicants made that very easy to do. They made it clear and for us to understand what was being trying to be achieved. The second thing that is incredibly important to us is that these projects can be implemented and they can be successful. What's the point of a $40 million grant if it doesn't achieve the outcomes it's seeking to do? So successful applicants in this evaluation criteria really provided us confidence that they'd be able to execute on these programs, and that either through their past track record, through how they did evaluation, how plan on doing evaluation, just all the specifics around those implementation and projects, why we should have confidence that this group of teams and these investments would be executed well and they would be implemented successfully. I would say some common pitfalls here is that oftentimes we'd see sort of a shotgun approach where there'd be 4 or 5, 6 or 7 different programs or interventions called for EDA investment, but really there wasn't a coherent story on why they fit together. They seemed like disjoined ideas versus a coherent regional strategy. Second, we often saw a lack of clarity around why there was significant demand. One of the things that I think we've identified as a major problem in economic development is how well we are attuned to end user needs, be them businesses or workers. So being able to signal that these aren't just ideas that someone came up with, or a given leader in an organization prioritizes, or a consultant or otherwise came up with, that there's actually demand for these programs. Sometimes applicants signaled that by prior examples. So they said, here's a pilot we ran, and here were the uses of that pilot, and this is why scaling that up makes sense. Other times they identified some of those root causes and clearly made an argument for why the interventions would serve the root cause needs. But we were looking for evidence of demand for the program. And then finally, oftentimes there's a complete lack of metrics of success. How would you know when you were done? How would you know whether or not the workforce training program that EDA built was successful? Was it had served its purpose? What was success look like? And how would you know if you were unsuccessful? So really understanding what success looked like and whether or not the proposed organizations leading this work had execution experience, had they done things, and even if they haven't done things like this, why were they the right teams? Why did they reflect the community and other types of things to ensure that they would be successful going forward? The third evaluation criteria, and EDA's number one investment criteria across the board, was equity, inclusion, and diversity. Of course, for this particular program, it is incredibly important, if not the most important thing. And a couple of elements really did shine through. So first, strong applicants made it overabundantly clear the involvement of underserved communities and groups. They were not just sort of like lines in the 8-pagers. They were reflected in budgets. They were reflected in leadership teams. It really was an important part of this. As part and parcel of that, when we looked at the 8-page narratives and we compared it to your very high-level budget narratives, there was alignment from an equity perspective. So, just to show you were anticipating putting your money where your equity ideas were, that was important to us. I would say some common pitfalls that emerged in the equity section. So one, I was surprised, to be honest, that equity was missing from a number of proposals and applications, which would have been very hard for an applicant to be successful in this program without equity being woven throughout the proposal or its own individual section, or often the equity piece was very limited. And specifically here, we wanted goals, right? You prioritize what you measure. And so to the extent you have equity priorities and goals in your application, it signaled you thought about it. And it's something that was a priority and something you considered. That was absent in some unsuccessful applications. Two, I would say like the level of specificity and how well things were tailored to the needs of underserved communities. Oftentimes, we would see an application that would say, we need this infrastructure project, or we have investments in broadband that are important, or just a list of ideas around investment ideas. And it was left to be assumed that those would be helpful and needed for underserved communities, but it wasn't exactly clear exactly why those were needed, or those were the particular things, or what was the buy-in from those communities. And then finally, I'll say, really, we combed through letters of support. We had an entire team looking at them and other ideas to really get a sense for who was at the table, who was at the table in a genuine sense, who was at the table in more of a illustrative or performative sense, and how did that reflect your approach and priorities. And that did reflect how we made decisions. The fourth criteria that we really looked at was regional assets. So EDA takes an assets-based approach. We think all communities have assets. They do not always need to be financial or even economic. Sometimes they're great organizations or leadership or teams or program ideas or a number of other things. So first and foremost, strong applications laid that out. So they really did lay out what their assets were. And I think one thing that we saw is those assets really aligned with broader strategies. So what you would hear, for example, is you would hear, this is a program that is really successful in the community. It's had a success bringing people on. And from that, we've learned X, Y, and Z that we are expanding to our broader coalition. Or you might read something to the effect of, we have a regional employer, that's an asset, but what will be a really excellent use of that asset is to then say, this is what the regional employer is doing as part of the broader strategy. This is the seat they have at the table. So again, not just having assets and articulating them, but showing how those assets influence and inform the overall broader strategy. The second element of this is how those assets represented your economic starting position. So again, every place has an economic starting position. Some are further along than others, which is the point of this program. But I think we wanted to know, what are your economic assets? What are the things you currently have? And what is EDA building from, right? So creating a clear picture in our minds, so to speak, of what the baseline is, so to speak. And again, sometimes that baseline was, we are a region adjacent to natural resources, and these are the way some communities are taking advantage of those resources, but we're not, and this is what we would do about it. Other times, it's demographics. We have seen an explosion of our Black and brown communities, and we think this is a wonderful asset to grow in terms of training and other things and job fulfillment, but for certain investments and things that EDA could provide. So again, how does the assets you brought to the table serve as an economic starting position, and how are you building from that starting position? Similarly, some common pitfalls here. I think, sometimes regional assets were actually quite ambiguous. Or quite unclear. Things like we've got, a hardworking population, or we have, a legacy of industry, or things that it was hard for us to wrap our head around what it means and how you're going to build from it. And then more importantly, how those assets really align with the goals of the Recompete program, which is jobs for folks that are largely left out. So that was a really critical, important element of all of this. And then the final thing I'll say on this is there was often a minimal discussion on how assets would be further or unlocked over time. One of the things we really liked about good, successful proposals is they kind of created a roadmap, things where they were going. And so one thing that we were missing from a number of proposals is that they articulated an asset as sort of a moment in time instead of saying, as part of this effort, like this asset really could be put on steroids and could do a lot more for this community, this organization, this leadership team, this program. And this is how these investments are going to help us build out the things that were already really, really strong. So the next criteria is targeted geographic approach. I know my colleague Rachel has a comment. Rachel, feel free to jump in, or if you want me to dive through the strengths and weaknesses, happy to do it either way.
Yeah, maybe why don't you go through the slide first, Scott, and then I can call out. There's a question from Derek just clarifying something earlier on, I think it was population size and geographic approach. So why don't you go first, and then I can read it out later.
Okay, great. So targeted geographic approach, this was a little different for this than I think what a lot of folks have been historically used to in EDA or other programs, but it was critical. The sort of bumper sticker we said about this program was it's meant to make a discernible difference in a particular place. And so we had no biases or priors on the size or scope or anything of geography. What we wanted is a really clear argument and articulation of why your geographic approach made sense and why investments of these sizes, phase 2 implementation awards, could make a meaningful and discernible impact on your chosen service area. And so that's the first thing that we really saw for successful ones, is that they align with an applicant's goal. They said, for example, this was a historically distressed area that represented, 15 square blocks of this particular city, and 4 employers have left, and what we're going to do is train in these types of areas. Or this is a large rural 15 county area that is connected by a common industry sector, and this is why these particular training interventions spread out over particular areas can be meaningful. But just a specific sense for why the geography aligned with those goals, and we thought the budget was right-sized for what you were trying to achieve geographically. And then I'll also say that there's alignment in successful applicants between the service area and all other elements of the proposal. The partners made sense for the service area, lead organizations, the needs assessment, that underlying conditions, target populations, the investments, all of it sort of made sense based on the area that you wanted to work in. It really told a coherent strategy. Equally, I'll say some common pitfalls here is that the largest one is there just really there was not an argument. Either it wasn't in the application or it wasn't persuasive. Oftentimes this meant maybe our assumption was, because we didn't receive evidence in the application, maybe funding might be spread too thin, or maybe it wouldn't go to particular populations. We just didn't know. There was many times, and this is across the board, and I think a critique that we're trying to solve in economic development in general, which is sort of a build it and they will come philosophy, which is all we need is to sort of put these investments in an area or a place, and demand, businesses will come to them, entrepreneurs will use the accelerator spaces, workers will come to the training building. All we need to do is build it and all of them will come. We don't adopt that philosophy. We want a strategy behind those, and geography was a critical element of that. And then finally, I think there was often a unclear pathway to really high quality jobs. Here, what we ultimately want, and we know it might take time, but we want to invest in places that ultimately will create jobs that create family sustaining wages and really pathways to opportunity for people. And we wanted that to be, and that was a specific element of this criteria if you look back in NOFO 1. Rachel, do you want to jump in, and then I'll do the evaluation criteria?
Yep, perfect. Thanks, Scott. So I'm seeing a question from Derek, which I think might have just been maybe a miscommunication that we should clarify. So Derek's saying that earlier, it sounded like you were saying places with this population under 250,000 people might not have scored well, or smaller population areas were not likely to do well. I just wanted to know if that was noted in the requirements for eligibility. So again, I think maybe just a miscommunication, if you can clarify in context of either this criteria or more broadly for the program.
Yep.
There.
Yep, I was actually saying the opposite, which was like when we looked at the service areas, oftentimes like if you were too big, you were trying to, take a $20 million investment and fix a 2.5 million person city, like that'd be a little infeasible. So I was saying the opposite, like sometimes the service areas didn't align with with this, what would be feasible with grants of this size. But I will say to your question on what was there too small, absolutely not. If you look at some of our finalists, we've got service areas that are in the thousands of people, not even tens of thousands, which is a-okay. We've got we've got a few square blocks, and we've got large areas but are sparsely populated. We've got a number of very small towns. So no, it certainly was not the case that smaller geographies, smaller populations were less competitive. In some ways, no, that wasn't true. What I was trying to say is we wanted, when you picked the service area, the service area could be much smaller than the county or the city or the state, of course. We wanted a logic, and we wanted to make sure that service area could be moved forward and successful through these interventions. So that's what I was mentioning, but happy to talk more about it.
Perfect. Thanks, Scott.
Yep. Okay, so I'll walk through this last one, and then we'll turn to SDGs fairly quickly. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So the last evaluation criteria was on partners and potential commitments. And here I'll just say this was all context specific. So some places didn't, maybe more rural, or others might not have the opportunity for as many partnerships. So the quality of the partnerships that existed were really important. Or maybe there weren't as opportunity rich for, financial commitments, a-okay. None of that impacted anyone's competitiveness in this program. What we did see and we're looking for is that if you did have specific partners, and everyone should have partners, whether there are few or many, they were tied to goals. Second, we saw tangible examples in those letters of how partners would contribute, right? Like we actually wanted to know in this way, a handful, 4 or 5 letters that like sort of even signaled where you wanted to go with something was more valuable than 50 sort of form letters. And then we were looking for private sector engagement. Obviously, the private sector represents the lion's share of employment, and jobs are what this program's about. So it would be hard to be successful if you didn't have any employers involved at all. And so that was something we were looking for. In pit letters, pitfalls, we did see a large number of sort of very generic letters of support. Of course, that happens a lot, but I think we also wanted at least some signals in the 8 pages of how in phase 2 you'd go further than that, and oftentimes that was absent. Oftentimes, how these partners would participate was absent. And then finally, in terms of equity and diversity, as well as involvement of businesses, we often found that the proposal laid out a strategy where it's very clear a particular type of partner would be needed to fulfill that strategy, and those were missing. So, you might have, let's say you have an electric vehicle play, and there are no electric vehicle companies mentioned at all in your proposal. That would be problematic. So
there's a question in the chat that I think might be good for you to highlight either here or in relation to the equity criteria. So great question. Matt's asking, if an eligible community is 95% white, for example, how should they begin to address the equity question in response to this program?
Yeah, totally. Great question. And so again, everything about this program is context dependent on the community. So in that particular example, if it's a rural area, including rural individuals, if it's often including people of lower economic development, economic status and income is something that's important. I think there's a number of different ways to signal in predominantly one race or otherwise areas that you're focused on equity and diversity. I will say EDA's definition of equity and diversity is not solely demographic based. It's also geographic based or rural, distress, and otherwise. So, and if you look at our 22 finalists, there are a number of areas that represent those sort of more rural, whiter parts of the country, just as we have a number of largely minority serving areas in a number of other areas. So I think, if you look at those finalists, it does represent the cross section. But the way to answer the specific question, every community, by definition, has people who have been underinvested in and represent equitable elements of their community, or you wouldn't qualify for this program. And so we were looking for specific ways you were working with those populations in that particular area. But it was not, if demographic or geographic or other elements of equity and diversity weren't applicable, you wouldn't be held accountable. Okay, so I want to dive into strategy development grants. These hopefully are fairly clear, so I'll spend just a couple minutes on these and then really wanted to open it up for questions. So first, on regional conditions and preliminary assessments of interventions. Hopefully this makes sense, but here, what did we want? We wanted to know, what's the state of play? What are the underlying conditions, similarly to the to the first one in the Recompete plans? And we wanted to know a clear sense, like, what types of interventions. Again, this is for a planning grant. You don't need to have crystal clear ideas, but we do wanted to get a sense, like, what is the planning grant meant to help? Like, what are the types of interventions? Like, do you have a sense for them? Do they make sense? Common pitfalls here were really a lack of analysis around those local assets and needs. What did it look like? And then I would say the largest pitfall is the interventions didn't seem to have any relationship to the regional conditions. And here you might say, in our app, if you go back and relook at your 5-page strategy development grant, you might say, well, they are linked, but we didn't make a good job really making that crystal clear. When only 7% of applicants, just the number of applicants we received, were successful, making that crystal clear and being very explicit, not implicit, on these things is really important. Secondly, the proposed uses of the strategy development grant. Oftentimes we found, so I'll start with strengths, things that just helped us out: timelines, goals, process. How would you actually spend this money? What would it look like? Oftentimes the strategy development grants kind of looked like carbon copies of the Recompete plan and didn't give us anything additionally. And then how would this actually move the ball, right? What we want, we don't just want a planning grant. I think this program's critique of a sort of a lot of planning grants is they're not goal focused. So we wanted to know, what would this do that would move you towards your regional vision? And oftentimes that was lacking. And then I think also was lacking the specifics around how it would be tied to the actual goals of this program. Underserved workers, a lot of times there were things like, we're going to build this feasibility study at the local university, which is A-OK, and we funded a lot of that. But we want to know why. What would success look like? Secondly, around organizational leadership capacity, we really wanted to know, one, who were the core group around the table? Do they reflect the community? But also, why were they there, right? I think some common pitfalls that we saw was, we'd get into your budget and we'd see, individuals, and when we kind of, looked at people's backgrounds, they'd never done anything like this before, or it was unclear why this organization was leading the strategy development activity. And then often what we were looking for is experience engaging with underserved communities, and that's critical. So we might have an example where there was a really great university who wanted to do a feasibility study or something like that, and there was a number of faculty members working on it, but we had no sense from the 5-pager what experience the team had working with underserved communities. Third, I'll say is or fourth, I'll say is the budget, right? We wanted to know, what were you spending money on? What would you spend the $500,000 on? First and foremost, like clarity in budget was actually really, really valuable. And again, it didn't have to be, I's dotted and every T's crossed. These were planning grants, but we were looking for, if there's personnel, consultants, contracts in there, and people associated, we did sort of due diligence on that. And we wanted to know whether or not those, if you were hiring consultants, like, did we think these folks, had experience and success doing this. Oftentimes the budgets were just too ambiguous. They just we just couldn't really wrap our head around what you wanted to do or how our resources were going to get spent. And then, another thing is they deviated from the program sometimes. So there's things that were really interesting in there, but we just ultimately, this isn't a big program and we want to stay laser focused on our goal of prime age employment and wages. And then we wanted to see, these strategy grants really building local capacity over time. So we wanted to ensure, if 100% of your resources were going, you were an organization out of Iowa and 100% of your resources were going to a consultant in Miami, we might question that, right? To how well that's going to build local capacity in your region over time. So let me pause there. We've got about 10 minutes left. I can go a couple minutes over as well, but we really want to open it up for questions, any sort of feedback or thoughts we can give to folks over time. I'll stop sharing my screen. But again, we fully hope to run this program and other very large national programs like it over time. So this is your opportunity to ask questions. This is your opportunity to sort of really get a sense for how we are thinking about this. We spend a lot of time on this evaluation, so we want to be as helpful as possible.
Great. Thanks, Scott. I wanted to make 2 quick housekeeping notes just because I'm seeing a lot of them come up in the questions, and then we'll shout a few of these out for you to wrap up the time. 1, thank you everyone for the questions, really good points. I'm seeing very commonly, are we able to receive individualized feedback or a copy of our scorecard? Unfortunately, it is EDA practice and practice with these national competitions not to provide specific feedback to those in phase 1, just given the volume of applicants. We really wish we could do so. We would encourage you, to consider the points that we just covered in today's webinar in the context of your application. And then the second point I was going to make on housekeeping is we have published on our Recompete website the project narratives of all 22 finalists, as well as all 24 strategy development grant winners. So I think a few of you are craving kind of more details or more concrete examples of the points that Scott covered today. So if it's helpful and if you have time, we would really encourage you to go kind of skim through some of those narratives. Maybe there's one closer to your region or in a similar community for reference. So again, apologies, we cannot provide individualized feedback, but hoping that those are good resources to you as you continue to evolve your local economic strategies. In terms of questions for you, Scott, Derek has a question, which I think it would be great to clarify. So our EDA reps mentioned that we could not address the region outside of the boundaries offered on the map, which limited us to only having the opportunity to use a small area. But listening now, it sounds like we are supposed to address a regional strategy and how we would positively impact everything. Could you please clarify?
Yeah, so if I understand the question correctly, maybe this is a semantics issue when I say region. When I'm using that like interchangeably with the service area you pick. So your region as like economically might be defined as the Midwest or Ohio or something. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is like whatever the geography you picked, your service area, which of course you're right, needed to be, and that was defined by Congress for us, an eligible area. That's when I say region, that's what I mean. So I don't mean you need to have radiating impacts to the broader Midwest region. I only mean your service. Rachel, are there others? Do you want me to jump in? What's the best way?
Sorry, can you hear me, Scott?
Now I can.
Sorry about that. I was just saying, so there's a few more questions around kind of the relationship between the strategy development grant portfolio and the Recompete plan approval portfolio. So I think a couple questions around, how are those two related to each other, if at all? And then for those specifically that received Recompete plan approval but have no funding, how are those kind of strategy development grants evaluated?
Yep. So I think so we ran individual processes and merit review processes for both the SDGs and the Recompete plans. And there's some overlap. 15 of the 22 received planning grants. I think as with anything, part of the competition, a lot of it was based on the quality of the planning grant proposal. Also, sometimes it was a needs assessment. Did we think that it would really move the ball forward? But again, those planning grants proposals were developed or evaluated individually. And so that's how you kind of saw a gap where some did and some didn't. But I'll say it is no indication of quality of the Recompete plans whatsoever. Similarly to those planning grants that received the planning grant but were not and a good use of resources. We thought they were a good investment for the $500,000, but didn't think they were quite ready for the implementation dollars in that competition. So that would be an example why someone might have won a planning grant, but not a invitation to phase 2.
Great, thanks, Scott.
Yep.
And then one other housekeeping note, thank you team for reminding me, seeing a few questions about if this will be recorded and posted. Yes, we will be sharing the recording out after this webinar so that you can need to digest and share it with your team. So again, this recording will be put online so that folks have access to it after the fact. One more question, and then I think we might be towards the end for today. Our regional partners also received a Tech Hubs designation, and now we're a finalist for Recompete. Are there any recommendations for those who are applying for implementation dollars for both programs? Is it possible to receive funding from both programs for the same city?
The short answer is yes, they're different competitions. They're not mutually exclusive. But I will say for those who were finalists, please do reach out to your program officer. We want to make sure that the time here is primarily for those that were unsuccessful in this first competition. But I think it's a fair question. We'll have we've actually got a lot on that particular question. Just ping your program officer and we'll follow up. I do want to say really quickly, just to follow up on one thing that Rachel was talking about in terms of, we would love to give individual feedback. It's just a fairness issue. We don't have the bandwidth for the 563 applications to provide it for everyone. And if we did it for some, it would just simply be unfair. So if anyone has any ideas how we could feasibly provide some feedback to everyone, shoot me a note at sandies@eda.gov. But we just can't, we just don't know how to do that. So that really is the constraint on that.
On the topic of providing us feedback and ideas, this is less a question, but more a comment from Mary Ellen. So thank you, Mary Ellen. I'll just share it out for the group. Our greatest challenge was the 8-page limit to thoroughly and yet concisely answer all of the details needed. We would like to suggest that the grant specifically ask questions and allow us to answer those questions rather than the tell us about type of details in the writing of the NOFO. So as Scott kind of alluded to, thank you everyone for your inputs. Please, if you have additional feedback for us on the program or your experience too, we'd always welcome that through recompete@eda.gov. I think maybe one more question on equity approaches. Thank you all for the great inputs here. Lenore is asking, was or is it problematic that the proposal was focused on a specific underserved community as opposed to the whole community when writing the applications?
Yep, great question. So in that, I often would be. So the short answer is absolutely not, right? Like, I think, we saw this in a number of cases, absolutely not. And sometimes that was really compelling that it was focused on a particular group, a group that the organizations knew really, really well. I would say that you can hear a caveat in my voice, and that caveat is there may be instances in which the service area you picked or the community you try to impact, for example, if it was 97% Hispanic and you wanted to work on I don't know, some other group and like had nothing to do with Hispanics, despite there being 97% of the population, like that might be a little odd for us. Like, how can, this is what the community looks like. So we did take into consideration like the actual realities of the areas you brought forward, but that was super rare that would be a concern. Primarily, no, we saw no problem whatsoever with a targeted approach for a targeted group, assuming that group met the distress criteria that we were looking for. So no problems whatsoever.
Great. Thanks, Scott. And then I'm sorry, I said last question, but I promise this is the actual last one, and then we'll close out for today. Jennifer has a question. Any suggestions as to how smaller organizations with less resources, for example, staff, previous experience, funding, etc., have a better chance of receiving an award? It seems that there's a disadvantage or disadvantage smaller organizations and communities, and larger orgs seem to be the winners. So, Scott, I'll turn it to you on this one.
Yep. So this was something that we really wanted to focus on in the phase 1 process, and I think time will tell to see how good a job we did. I push back a little bit and say that I do think if you dig into the 22 to 24, there are a variety of groups, but I do think it's a fair point that like when you've got competitions that are only able to award top 10, 7%, like it is like competitive and hard. So I think. One thing that we did to try to help smaller organizations and others is like reduce the what's required in phase 1. So instead of a bunch of additional all kinds of government forms and whatnot, we've tried to keep it pretty simple to 8 pages. Of course, then you get the criticism that it was hard to compile everything into 8 pages. But we did try to simplify the process. So that's one thing we government agencies can do. I think the second thing we tried to do is try to keep the budget narratives very high level and not, require a ton of detail. That was another effort to make this accessible for smaller organizations. I think, though, to answer specifically your question for this program and future rounds, I think like in a number of ways, those types of organizations really do represent the communities where they serve, even if they haven't received a ton of federal grants in the past. And I think that's what we're looking for, right? We're not looking for organizations that have managed billions of dollars necessarily. What we're really looking for is organizations that reflect the needs of their community and know how to address those. So my answer to you would be to just sort of like lead with your strength. You might even say, as a small community nonprofit, if you look at some of our outcome metrics over the last blah, blah, blah years, we're excellent at certain things, and just like lead with your strengths. One of the things that we've been telling folks is think about like what's your unfair advantage, so to speak, like why is your application and your idea really compelling, and your ability to sort of talk about how you meet community needs could be that. But I will say we are always on the hunt to make these processes easier and more open. So if you've got other ideas, like shoot us. We're constantly iterating on this. I like the idea of questions. I think that's a good one, and others. So let me pause there. I know we're a little bit over, but are there any other questions or anything else that we can do? We're also happy to do more of these if people find them useful over time. Anything else, Rachel? Doesn't look like it. All right. I see the C. Oh, it says there's something. Well, if people can still hear me, it says there's something wrong with my network. Really appreciate the time. Thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.